Hello and welcome to the Paier College Western Civilization Part 1 class. We're moving on to the end of the High Middle Ages and looking particularly at Crusades, militant orders, and the politics of the centralized monarchies that sort of arose during that time period. After this, if there's time, we will move immediately on to the late Middle Ages and the rather climactic events that focused around that. Now, as we said before, at the end of last class, the Crusades marked a fascinating period in the West's history. It was focused around the idea of a united Christendom, that even the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches might work together. Now, the Crusades began with the concept of Constantinople requesting the Pope to see if some people would come and assist them in the retaking of Jerusalem after the Islamic forces had captured it. Unfortunately, for the Eastern Orthodox Church and for Islam, the Pope actually turned this into a political power grab and used it to attempt to unify and bring together many of his forces. And so it became the Crusades, and the series of Crusades that followed were in many ways a political natured battle about power in Europe as much, if not more, than the power in the Near East. And indeed, the Crusades were not generally viewed as concerning to the Islamic forces. After all, they were dealing with the edge of their empire, not Mecca itself or Baghdad later, but the sort of the barbaric, if you were, Christian edge of the empire. So as a result, the Muslim forces never quite took it as seriously as the Christian. Now, one of the things, before we get on to the Crusades themselves, which we will discover in a little greater depth in just a bit, we're also going to continue speaking about those who pray. Now, if you remember, last class we had divided society into three basic elements in the West. Those who work, those being peasants, yeomen, and serfs. Those who fight, being the noble classes, and those who pray, being the priestly classes. Here, however, we have a bit of an overlap. For amongst the powers that be, certain holy orders were formed that instead of working to pray or illuminating manuscripts and doing intellectual work to pray, there were those military orders who fought to pray. And these formed into religious orders. Now, some of these religious orders were tied to nations, such as in Portugal and Spain, but many of them became focused on the church itself and vowed fealty only to the Pope. Now, in this order, they were not allowed to interfere with what was considered local politics. So if you had a Templar order, say, focused in Marseille, you were not allowed, as the Templar order, to have anything to do with any local battles that were going on or problems that were going on there. The goal of these knights was to protect the Holy Land and pilgrims. Now, who would join these orders and why? Well, for one thing, they proved to be very good orders for good homes, as it were, for second sons or third sons who had a more warrior bent. Let's say the full-time professional soldiers who they were indeed full-time professional soldiers who practiced fighting in order to pray. Think of it as if they're doing elaborate long-term katas or martial arts forms the way that, say, Shaolin monks do. This is a warrior priesthood, a warrior monk whose job it was to risk his life to defend the faith. And this proved an excellent home for anybody who was not going to inherit a title. Well, for one thing, because life in any religious order was usually better than life without such wealth. After all, life in religious order was relatively nice. You had a clean room, you had companionship of like-minded people and things such as that. Also, it meant that there was no need to create a dowry to maintain said priests. Said second sons. It was often that a donation would be given to a church to take these in, to an order to take in such people, often grants of land or the like. But once it was paid, and you didn't have to worry about the second son coming back and asking for more money, nor in some way threatening or undermining the reign of the inheriting child. Now, this also created a troop of soldiers from the church's viewpoint who were loyal to the church above and beyond all else. Indeed, that's what they were vowed to protect: the church, pilgrims, holy sites, things such as that. And that, therefore, added to the military strength of the Pope. Now, you may recall there was a time in which there was that we mentioned the growing struggle between the Pope and certain monarchs, because the Pope held the right to appoint bishops, whereas monarchs wanted the right to appoint bishops. Well, the church, of course, would have said, well, if we are the ones who anoint you, we have the might over all. There were many of the more secular nature, the kings and such, who said, well, if we have an army, then might proves right. Well, here we see the Pope getting an army of his own, of full-time warriors who did not police or do anything other than practice to become warriors. And that raised the concerns of many kings and lords, leading to the eventual disillusionment of many, if not all, of the orders, and the disempowerment, so that they were broken down. Indeed, the Knights Templar were dissolved as an order during the High Middle Ages because they proved to be such a political and economic threat to the national powers all around. Who then were these militant orders? What was their general form? Well, we'll begin with the international orders. These were not the first to be founded, but they became some of the most important. We'll start with the Knights Hospitaller. These were knights who set up hospices, that is to say, places of refuge for pilgrims along the roads to the Holy Land and to other religious sites. And their job was to house, clothe, and indeed defend pilgrims from anyone who might attack them. Because pilgrims were a natural target, weren't they? They were just people walking along. Now, often they didn't have very much money, but that didn't stop people from attacking them, or indeed taking any offerings they had, or indeed taking them and putting them into slavery. So the Knights Hospitaller, their job was to protect and keep open the routes of pilgrimages. Then there was the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. That is an order focused on the gravesite of, supposed gravesite at least, of Jesus of Nazareth. And it is said that their job was to protect that and the lands around. Then came the most famous of the knights, that is the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Templar were a very particularly powerful order, and Again, their job was really to defend the Holy Land and to serve the Pope, but they also formed one of the more elite series of guards among the process, and ended up gaining great amounts of territory and wealth throughout Europe. This was their eventual undoing, indeed, because the somewhat jealous monarchs began framing them. And in fact, there was a period where, say, in the Great Templars of York, the knights were rounded up. They were accused of all sorts of heathen and blasphemous elements, such as worshipping Baal, who was a great god's head, involving themselves in all sorts of sexual depravity, according to the Middle Ages, as well as all sorts of sacrilegious rites and dark rituals. They were all found innocent of that, funny enough. But it didn't matter, because by that time, their reputation had been spoiled, and shortly thereafter, they were disillusioned. Then there's the Order of Saint Lazarus. That's Saint Lazarus, not Stain Lazarus, as it says up there. And then there was a whole series of national orders. These were religious orders tied to a country. So in Tuscany, there was the Order of St. James. And in other locations, there were other ones as well, most notably those of Portugal and Spain, where the power of the church was tied to the retaking of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. Now, the early Crusades, that is to say, the First, Second, and Third Crusade, were highly political elements in which the Western Church, that is the church as ruled by the Pope, gathered together what troops it could and started in by doing a series of battles across, well, parts in Europe, defending that, but also across the Seljuk and Fatimid kingdoms of the Islamic states, reclaiming and eventually conquering some of the lands that were held. Indeed, the Crusader states of 1140 totally conquered and built kingdoms inside the Holy Land, that is, inside the Levant, right along the coastline, which proved to be very powerful political elements as well, ruled by people such as King Baldwin the Mad and such like that. These were states that held their own political power, individual powers held and maintained by crusaders. The late Crusades, however, proved a little bit different, with the Fourth Crusade taking an interesting sideline, and instead of going down and attacking the Holy Land, the knights took a sidestep and attacked Constantinople, which of course was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. That they sacked and looted and then took all the goods out of there because they could. Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth Crusades, they all went back and forth and went fighting time and time again for the principalities and countries of Tripoli, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, things such as that, trying eternally to liberate the Holy Lands, as they were called, the Levant territories, and constantly either winning or being defeated by the Islamic states as they went forward. Now, that led to a power element between a power struggle between the church and others. And as the church began to grow, this is the Western church in particular, they began to suppress certain religious uprisings and accommodate others. Now, the Albigensian crusade was one of the crusades that was not focused on the Holy Land, but indeed was focused on Central Europe. What had happened was that the Waldensteins in Central Europe created a heresy group, as it was called by the church, that was condemned as heretics in 1181, and that began what was referred to as the Albigensian Crusade, the late 1100s to early 1200s, which was the persecution and attempt to wipe out this Albigensian heresy. That also led to the infamous Inquisition. That is to say, the division of the Catholic Church that was focused on finding heresy and rooting it out. Now, originally, it was focused wholly on heretics. That is to say, individuals who were deviating and publicly deviating from the teachings of the church. Later on, as we'll see, at the very end of the Middle Ages, you began to get things such as the Spanish Inquisition, which were focused not just on heresy, but also on the of trying to root out the Islamic country, the Islamic powers, that is, the Islamic remnants of Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, particularly. That is, those individuals who had remained after the Iberian Peninsula, which, if you remember, up to now has been being held by Islam, was eventually, quote-unquote, liberated by the Christians, and the new Christian states were built there. The Inquisition began to be used to root out such Islamic people, and also Jews. And we'll get to all of this a little bit later, but the point of rooting out the Judaism as well is that anybody who had converted to Christianity, be it voluntarily or by force, was subjected to the ability to be inquisited by the church. That is to say, they could be investigated for backsliding, like, say, continuing to worship Jewish holidays or continuing to follow Islam. In other words, suggesting that these individuals had professed to Christianity just to stay in Christian Spain and were in the process of still reneging on the deal. That is to say, they were backsliding into their original religious practice. That's the theory, anyways. Now, that was in fact partially tied to the rise of the Dominicans. If you remember a discussion of the Dominicans before, these were one of the mendicant orders, the begging orders, that unlike the Franciscans, the Dominicans went out after the mind and beliefs of individuals and really focused on an intellectual life and form of conversion. Now, Peter Abelard was one of the individuals who attempted to reconcile faith and reason. This was a very Dominican-led element, but then quickly became part of the rest of the church as well. A reconciliation between faith and logic, as it were. Bernard of Clairvaux in 1090 to 11, who lived between 1090 to 1153, said, "I thought it unfitting that the grounds of faith should be handed over to a human reasoning for discussion." So he argued against that faith was faith and you should just take it. Compared to this, Thomas Aquinas, whose name you may have heard, he became a saint in later days, who lived between 1225 and 1274, wrote Summa Theologica, that is to say, a work of religious reason that argued in logical rhetoric for the existence of God and the reasons of faith, and why the different rules of the church existed and how they could be implemented. And indeed, it is much of Aquinas' reasoning that is still used by the Catholic Church today to come up with decisions and understandings about different religious matters. Now, something else that occurred during this time period was the increase in the population of Europe. Between 1000 and 1200, between the 1st century and the 10th century and the 13th century AD, the population more than doubled. It went from 37 million individuals to 74 million individuals in Europe. And much of that expansion forced movements to the east. As you can see here in this diagram, before 1100, there were movements. The majority of the population was indeed focused on the West, that is to say, Germany, France, and the like. But as the 1100s moved forward, through 11 to 1200, there was a drastic population increase moving further and further eastward as populations needed to expand and grow and find new places. This led to a series of great clearances. That is to say, the wild forest lands and the like were cut down, plowed under, and turned into farmlands. It also led to a series of new freedoms, because these were lands that were being inhabited from that were being inhabited by populations that moved into larger unpopulated areas, which meant there was fewer rules. But there were, of course, environmental consequences for this. There was massive deforestation, huge amount of smoke and ash, and pollution that formed during this time period, causing the Middle Ages to have what was referred to as the mini ice age, as the temperatures dramatically dropped across Europe at that time. There was also a revival of town life as the population grew. Communes and guilds grew and became the center of life in the medieval town. Communes being communities that shared wealth and goods, and guilds being unions, as it were, of professionals such as blacksmiths or millers or things such as that. There was also a growth in urban Jews. That is to say, those members of the Jewish faith who began dwelling in cities and maintaining their own somewhat separate group of mercantile and political alliances. Now, this was very useful because to them, after all, they knew they could be related to people, they could know these people through faith, they were all considered outsiders and treated very much so. Don't forget, Jews lay below slaves in the Western chain of being. So they were all outsiders, but outsiders together. And that allowed them to form a somewhat trusted network between each other. And that served very much to their advantage in one sense, but also helped to build them as feared outsiders on another, because here there were people who had secret understandings. Now, is that ridiculous? Of course it is, but that does not stop the fear from growing in a somewhat xenophobic population. By 1300, fewer than 10% of the population lived in towns of more than 5,000. So they're growing, but they're not huge yet. Now, this led to trade routes to be developed throughout the 12th and 13th century, and amongst these trade routes were fairs held as well. Now, these fairs could last for years. They aren't fairs in the sense that we think of them. They weren't fairs as in the sense that, there's merry-go-rounds and urban fairs or cow judging. These fairs were giant mercantile trading expositions where massive amounts of trans-European trade was conducted. And here you can see that there were numerous fairs held, particularly in Champagne. The Champagne region of France became very, very well known for the vastly wealthy and powerful fairs that they held there. There were also major trade routes that went around that tracked through across Europe and across its many stages. Now, one thing that this does not show is the trade route across the Silk Road heading off towards China. And that was a very, very key and important element that began to grow again during this time period. It had been there since the days of Rome, if you remember, but it grew more and more. And then you could say that Europe was divided into three sections. That is the northern zone, that is those tied together primarily by sea routes in the North Sea and the Baltic. There was the overland zone, that is those zones that were tied together in Central Europe and through the middle regions that were primarily held by overland trade routes, though as you can see the Black Sea fed into them quite nicely. And then there was the southern zone, which tied together the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world, and how these all began to overlap is one of the reasons why Champagne became such a region for fairs, because after all, that was the crossroads between the northern zone, the southern zone, and the overland zone. Now, feeding into the southern zone as well, as I mentioned before, was the route to the east. Now, as there was this economic rise of prosperity and a growth of wealth across the countries, as well as the rising intellectual capacities of the different churches and the like, and the different monasteries, there also became a rise of universities. Now, universities began as monastic orders that taught students, often, mostly, wealthy students who were paid, who had their way paid so that donations would be given to the church, and in return for these donations, their children would be educated. And this soon began to form into universities, that is to say, locations where advanced degrees would be studied. And these began with places such as the Sorbonne, which was, of course, in Paris and was the first of the real university settings, but quickly expanded into places such as Oxford, the first in Britain, to give advanced degrees, and focused around what was then known as Blackfriars College, and then University College, then New College, the second oldest continuous college in Oxford, and then soon Cambridge and another few university locations opened as well. Now, if you look across the map, the medieval universities actually began to spread quite rapidly. So the Sorbonne formed in the 12th century, quickly thereafter, working from individuals, from the Sorbonne, I should say, Oxford opened. Then in the 1209, Cambridge, starting with Corpus Christi, Cambridge, was founded. And then very rapidly, other colleges spread across all of Europe, including Salamanca and Trinity College Dublin and St. Andrews, and then all across the rest of Europe as well. Naples had one in the 1200s, 13th century. 14th century saw a large number of places open, including those in the more Russian zones, and then the 15th century saw a wide spread of other locations across Europe. So medieval universities began to grow and prosper, and with them was the spreading of education, which began to set the seeds of what would eventually become the Renaissance. Now, we won't be discussing the Renaissance quite yet, but we will be discussing it soon. Now, at the same time as this came the rise of governments working according to laws. England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and France each began to create centralized monarchies that were much more akin to the nation states we know of today than to their earlier medieval antecedents. Now, it all began really in the early Middle Ages, from 900 to the 1300s, where these monarchies began to form. You remember the rise of Charlemagne, you remember the rise of Alfred the Great, and things such as that, which we've discussed before. Now, this formed its way into a series of more solidified states. In medieval France, you had powerful groups focusing around the Ile-de-France, right in the middle of France there, but later growing into other elements as well. You also saw England very quickly become unified, and through invasion, Scotland and Wales fell under their yoke as well. And then the Holy Roman Empire, the other descendant of Charlemagne's people, began to form its powerful base, though its form of monarchy was quite different. Rather than a clear hereditary monarchy, there were electors. That is to say that the Holy Roman Emperor could well be chosen by from any number of princes who were known as electors. That is, those who could vote on who became emperor and elect them, or could be elected into such a position. Spain also began to rise as it began to drive the Moors out, and we'll get to that in the last class. Now, in England, we saw a rise from conquest to parliamentarianism. In 1066, William the Conqueror, known as William the Bastard, invaded England with his Norman force because he claimed that he was the rightful heir. That was contested by Harold and his Saxon individuals, who claimed that Harold was the rightful heir. Well, in the Battle of Hastings, William's forces attacked the Anglo-Saxons. They had quite a long battle. It was by no means one-sided battle. It's often portrayed as a clear Norman victory, and it was at the end, but it was a very hard-fought, day-long battle, which could have gone either way right up till the end. But then Harold was killed reportedly by an arrow to the eye, and so the contest ended. And this led William to invade the rest of England and eventually establish power there. Now, previous to this, I should say that Harold had previously defeated the Vikings before coming and attacking and defending against the Normans. The Vikings had claimed that they had the right to rule, so they went, and Harold managed to destroy the concept of the Danelaw, or what was left of it, and basically unify England under that. But then he lost his bid to William, who basically came in and defeated the Anglo-Saxons and led to a Norman overlordship of the Saxon population and an eventual blending of these two populations. For the Normans went and set themselves up and beyond all the others, all the existing Anglo-Saxons, but they didn't get rid of the Anglo-Saxon chieftains known as earls. Indeed, they adopted them into it. They ruled through them initially as a liege lord over a series of earls, and eventually began marrying into their families, thus unifying the country and creating a mixed Anglo-Saxon and Norman population. Of course, the earls eventually evolved into what is referred to as earls, which are the British form of counts in the system. Now, this led to a blending back and forth and an eventual unification of the population until in 1215, the Magna Carta, that is to say the Great Charter, was formed. Now, what was the Magna Carta? The Magna Carta is what happens when you have a weak and somewhat power-hungry king, in this case King John of Robin Hood fame, the younger brother and a terrible ruler of England, younger brother of Richard the Lionheart, who was not a particularly brilliant ruler either, became king, and he started somewhat abusing the offices of the kingship. He refused to give out titles that were required for him to give out and things such as that. So the barons and nobles got together and forced him to sign the Great Charter, which spelled out and limited his strengths and powers and effectively set up what would become the Parliament. This is essential for understanding Britain's rise to power later, particularly in the industrial age. One must understand the concept of how important a constitutional monarchy is and how it differs from the absolute monarchies of, say, France or the Holy Roman Empire. Here in the constitutional monarchy of Britain, the powers of the king were limited by the Magna Carta and spelled out that there were rules that had to be followed for raising taxes and things such as that were defined by the nobility. Now, often we talk about the Magna Carta as being the forerunner of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and in one sense it is, but in another it really is not. For whereas the concept that all men are created equal is the fundamental principle of the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, that was certainly not the case in the Magna Carta. Oh, it stated that there were laws and no one was above the law and the king had to follow the law, and that all these things existed, but that gave the power not to the people in general, but to the nobility. But it did set the seeds for Parliament, and that is what set apart British monarchies from those of the continent. Now, what was going on in the rest of the continent at that time was quite different. As mentioned before, Spain was in the heartthralls of the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, the taking of the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish hands, that is to say, the Islamic lords that ruled there, and putting it back into the hands of Christians. Now, indeed, the rule of Spain under the Moors, the rule of Iberian Peninsula under the Moors, was actually relatively liberal as far as it went. They were Christians and Jews were given rights, albeit secondary citizen rights, that did not exist before that. But there were, of course, those who wanted to reconquer the lands, and key amongst them were the kingdoms of Leon Castile Aragon, Portugal, and Granada. Now, Granada was, of course, the Muslim holdings. It was a central zone of Muslim holding. But the Reconquista began by invading southwards. And it was a long, long battle. Now, the Christian territories at 900, Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, were relatively powerful in and to themselves. But as it continued forward, as the Reconquista continued forward from 900 to 1150, you could see that Portugal was reclaimed. You can see that the central zones were, and a slow, gradual, inevitable reconquest of the peninsula kept going until 1250 AD, where only a tiny corner in the south of Granada was held by the Moors. Meanwhile, in France, the Capetian dynasty came into power. That began with Louis IX from 1214 to 1270. He was well known for having battled with his nobles, and a series of struggles went back and forth, and indeed some varying wars that we'll discuss eventually as well. Eventually, that led to the rise of Philip VI, who created the Estates General. The Estates General was the mechanism by which the king would rule in France, and it was in some ways vaguely similar to that of Britain, but not tremendously. It left the king with far more power. The Estates General created the division of the estate into three basic estates: the estate of the nobles, the estate of the church, and the estate of the commons. And it was a much less powerful system than that of Parliament, and led to a much greater unification of power under the hands of the French king. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, we saw a wide variety of powers move back and forth, dynasty after dynasty, beginning with the Saxon dynasty in about 800. That is to say, the remnants of the Charlemagne's empire, divided off from France and from the central Lorraine. Holy Roman Empire began with the Saxon dynasty, saw it move over then to the Salian dynasty, then to the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and leading finally to the Habsburg dynasty. Now, the key about the dynasties of the Holy Roman Empire is that the Holy Roman Emperor never really had as much solidified, unified power as either the kings or queens of France or Britain. He was the head of state, indeed, but each prince who lived under him, each noble, had their own, elector, one would say, had their own much more universal powers. They had their own laws, their own customs, and eventually became their own religions underneath the overall grip of the Holy Roman Emperor. And who sat on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire led very, very centrally to how politics were ruled. If you had a strong leader, then the empire would be unified underneath a strong emperor, so it would work much more as a single state. However, when weaker or less interested rulers came along, they would often find themselves with numerous bickering factions, and each county, each country, each electoral state, each principality would have its own arguing, bickering, individualized dynasty. Now, that changed at the end under the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs we'll talk about next term, or someone will talk about next term, and they focus on that was a focus on a set of families that began to marry in strategically to unify power, first in the Holy Roman Empire, then in Spain, and then eventually across all of Europe. Indeed, there's not a single monarch or descendant of a monarch in Europe today that is not in some way or another descended from the Habsburgs. And through that, they hope to create a unified Europe, the kind of unified Europe that only the Pope had been working towards before. But one can say that under the Holy Roman Empire, as much as it was a single state, it did not equate to a unified Germany. As said before, the states, when there was a stronger emperor, would be almost functioning as a state, but otherwise was a loose confederation of independent states, each acting on their own and somewhat tied together under the overarching realm of the title empire. So what does that then tell us about the High Middle Ages? Well, it was a time of rejuvenation across Europe. It led to clearly delineated social order, with the great chain of being between God to the king to the lowliest peasants to the animals being all defined. It led to a sense of stability and safety. Now, say what you will about the curses of a hierarchical system, and there are many. Please do not get me wrong. I would not want to live in one. But one thing it did generally offer was order and structure. And in American life, we often forget the appeal of order and structure. You can see it in many other countries, such as in China and in some countries in South America, where the desire for safety overwhelms this desire for individual freedoms. Because, after all, if there is a strong central government, you're less likely to be accosted on the streets. Of course, if there's a strong central government, you're also less likely to be able to say whatever you want to say. But these are swings and roundabouts. There was a sense of urban growth in the High Middle Ages, a real time of power and growth and economic and population growth, where cities began to take on lives of their own, lives that were not directly tied to the lives of the rural populations. There was a growth in learning, both within the church and also outside of it, as the church expanded its boundaries and allowed the teaching of lay populations, usually nobles, but sometimes others as well. We saw the development of monarchies in their modern sense, of a hierarchical noble with a court that follows underneath. In the case of France, that court had some political powers. In the case of England, it had many more political powers. And in the case of, say, Spain, it had fewer. We also saw a growth in the strength of the church and the rise of the Crusades. And all of those elements lead us forward to what we will be discussing in the next class. The late Middle Ages, a time of war between states, war within states, of plague, famine, and death. The late Middle Ages were, if anything, a brilliant reminder of the fear of the four horsemen of the apocalypse spoken about in the book of Revelations. The Christian faith grew even stronger and began to diversify during this time. Thank you very much.